why is the Indian government spending its time on contesting that when there are enough public records available to point out that these names were what they were? I mean,
and the Indian government has asked for explanations why these names have been closely associated with Hindu god.
The Netflix thing, frankly, is just a waste of time.
I do think of the SEBI head as partly a reflection of the current government.
Then can the government itself launch a fair inquiry into these allegations?
Hi, and welcome to episode 28 of the India Dialogue. We're grateful that you're listening to us. My name is Ruchir. As always, I'm joined by my co hosts Mitali and Manu. Mitali is the acting director at the Reuters Institute and a journalist well known for her time at CNBC. She's also an author who's written a book on crypto crimes. Manu is an advocate, a lawyer with his own law practice, and a spokesperson for DMK. I'm Ruchir. I'm the CEO at Distributed Energy and chair at the School of Policy and Governance. Every week, we try to unpack issues that matter in India. We try and go deeper and, where necessary, either explain or share our views. Hopefully, get to a place where we're also thinking about solutions. Today, as always, we'll cover two issues. Mitali will lead us through the first issue. Mitali?
Yeah, thank you, Ruchir. And 28 means that we're quite middle-aged now, so we're moving quite swiftly. It's great to hear that number. I hadn't sort of been registering it for the last few episodes. We're picking up two topics today. One is about free speech, which has really been in the mix in terms of news in India. And then we'll get to the more explanatory side of things, which is what we sometimes experiment with doing on the podcast around parliamentary standing committees. But let's start with free speech. And there's two sort of events that prompted us to discuss this. One is in court, which is that the Delhi High Court has issued a contempt of court notice against Wikipedia, which all of us know and use quite frequently, I think. And the court believes that Wikipedia has failed to provide information about who edited ANI's Wikipedia page. Now, for those who don't know, ANI is the Asian News International. It's sort of a really large wire service in India. And ANI has accused Wikipedia of publishing false content, defamatory content, on its page. Again, I think, as most of us know how Wikipedia works, it's kind of volunteer-based information. So it's not so much a single academic or a single citation. It's people pitching in with published and publicly available material to either corroborate something or to say, hey, hang on, that's not what happened around this person or this event. The court has now actually threatened to close Wikipedia's operations in India and to block that site. And in parallel, one is what's happening with the world of current affairs, if you will, and one is what's happening in the world of politics meets fiction, which is that there are lots of threats against Netflix because of the film that was recently released around the Kandahar hijacking episode. It's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. There's been a lot of criticism around it, and quite predictably, at least in India, the call now is to shut down Netflix or to end your Netflix subscription. All of which sort of leads to the point of where does free speech land in all this? So I think the best place to start is with Manu, who always puts the best context around this. Manu, walk us through what's happened with Wikipedia, what is being contested, and how this sits with the idea of free speech in India, at least.
It's actually fun to talk about India, but what I realized while you were giving that lovely introduction and background, Mitali, is also we must take cognizance of what happened or what is happening in Brazil, where Twitter, X, has now been banned after a face-off between the judiciary in Brazil and, of course, Twitter/X, and specifically Elon Musk. So really, that sets the context for free speech and the world. Of course, in India, as you rightly pointed out, the two key developments have been around Netflix and Wikipedia. Now, Firstly, free speech in India is quite different to free speech in other parts of the world, especially the United States of America. The American understanding of free speech is somewhat, I would say, absolutist. That free speech reigns supreme over all other considerations. In India, there is a constitutional right to free speech under Article 19, specifically Article 19(1). But Article 19 subclause 2 also includes something known as reasonable restrictions. So these are restrictions to freedom of speech itself. So in India, freedom of speech is not as absolute as it is in, say, other jurisdictions like the United States. And free speech is restricted along the lines of very many things, including defamation, considerations of security of the country, and so on and so forth. Now, while this is the sort of the generic background, the more recent background around free speech, especially online free speech or digital free speech, it has been around the evolution of the IT Act, the Information Technology Act, which goes back to 2001, and more recently, the Information Technology Rules, the IT Rules of 2021, which for the first time brought a sort of a little bit of regulation around online media, including social media, and especially came up with the definition of social media intermediaries. So these include even OTTs. These include, say, Twitter X. It includes Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And these all now have to respond or come under the supervisory control of the Indian government at large. So firstly, with Netflix, our understanding is that the Union of India, the government of India, has summoned Netflix in response to certain names that is being used in one of the Netflix shows, or I think it is a docu movie on IC 814, the Kandahar hijacking episode. And the Indian government has asked for explanations why these names have been portrayed or closely associated with Hindu gods. Now, that is one particular, I guess, limb of looking at how free speech can be curtailed. Now, Netflix would fairly argue that this would be a entertainment show, so the names and even the incidents are works of fiction. They may or may not have been inspired by real life events, but to be summoned for use of names which are associated with Hindu religious religious names or gods seems to be a little bit of a excessive authority. Now, this again goes back to how we look at even projection of movies and shows and documentaries, how the Indian censorship ecosystem functions, right? So even using names that are similar to one particular religion or otherwise seem to be routinely pulled up across India, whereas in other countries, this is not the case. Now, the other part is even more interesting, Mitali, because typically it is either private persons or people who are politicians who end up suing the media, saying that you have portrayed us in a wrong light or in a defamatory context, or you have tarnished my reputation, and so on and so forth. But the Delhi High Court case is particularly interesting because you have this large media conglomerate, as you said, the ANI, the Asian News International, and they have sued Wikipedia. Now, I don't know too many cases where the media has sort of initiated action for defamation against another media group, in a sense, right? Wikipedia being the other media group. Also, because by and large, media organizations have traditionally held the position that defamation is a form of some sort of a strategic legal action suit to shut down media, to create a chilling effect, and so on and so forth. But this is interesting that ANI has initiated and persisted with the action. Now, the action is very interesting because Wikipedia will be termed as an intermediary under the Indian IT rules, and under that they do have some protection. I think they have some immunity. It is referred to as a safe harbor provision, whereby Wikipedia is not responsible or directly cannot be held accountable for the actions of its users. As you all know, Wikipedia, anybody can go in and create updates and whatnot, but Wikipedia does have a mechanism to regulate and verify the authenticity of its sources, and then uses it to make sure the information that is ultimately published on Wikipedia has genuineness and has veracity. But here the question is, the Delhi High Court, upon the initiation of this action by ANI, has asked Wikipedia to divulge who the users are who have made certain edits to the page of ANI. My understanding is they have called ANI, they've accused ANI, or they have rather said that ANI peddles information at the behest of the government, or so on and so forth. But it's interesting, right? Now, if you reverse that, for a media organization, when they typically publish a news based on a source information, they generally do not divulge the details of the sources. So it's interesting to see what Wikipedia may or may not do. As I started by saying, similar judicial actions, again, even in Brazil, have resulted in the banning or suspension of Twitter there. So it'd be really interesting to see whether Indian courts have not gone that far in the past, but whether they would go that far and beyond, especially in the case of an organization like Wikipedia, which does still enjoy a great deal of acceptance and credibility across the world. But really, that's sort of what I think has brought free speech back into the mix. And of course, I think this is probably the fourth episode where we are referencing Twitter and Elon Musk. So I think, this whole last 2 years, whether or not you like Musk or otherwise, he has made sure that free speech remains very much on the front and center of so many discussions. So, Ruchir, I know you are a big ex Twitter user. So, what are your thoughts on what's happening?
Not as active as both of you, but I mean, the other arrest that happened last week in the epitome of free speech is France. They arrested Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, for not monitoring or not allowing access to Telegram's encryption. I think. Look, I am not an absolutist on free speech like the Americans are, and personally, for me, sort of, we build a society with expectations and rules for this very reason. The idea is that we want to advance humanity forward, and to do that, we want to coexist and live peacefully together. So a big part of me is like open to the idea of having certain restrictions on what is allowed to be said in the open and what is not. But I am an absolutist on advancement of technology for the advancement of humanity, and that means sometimes you will build tools that will be used for bad actions. There was a iconic photo I saw of ISIS leaders riding in Toyota in Iraq, and then it was like somebody said, like, should Toyota now be in jail for this? And you're not like you. If a tool is being used for bad actions, you can't blame the tooling company for that, right? I think that should the tooling company be asked to take something like to whatever in it, do what is in its control to curb or take action for sure. Then I think if there are rules that allow that curbing, they should be like not at the expense of abuse of power, right? Or not through abuse of power, but through normal regulation. So where I stand on something like what happened with Wikipedia is that ANI was not happy about it. The court said this does not seem fair, and Wikipedia, you need to take action. And I think, to me, The fact that it played out in a court and there is a court proceeding that led to the outcome, I'm actually comfortable with the court, the justice piece there. Last comment is I actually have a problem with how the Netflix situation has played out, which is that I mean, why is we know as a matter of fact that there were nicknames that the hijackers had. Netflix tried to render the original events. Why is the Indian government spending its time on contesting that when there are enough public records available to point out that these names were what they were? I mean, if why are we why are we questioning history when that's how it played out? So to me, I feel like that's a complete waste of taxpayer money in spending
But
time on that.
let me put it this way, back to you, Ruchir, and of course, Mitali. Um, Forget the Netflix incident, but going back 4 years, 5 years, Cambridge Analytica, the kind of role that various governments played and various governments did not play, right, in curbing the sort of the spread of misinformation, in curbing the extent of data breach that was proven. Don't you think governments should have a role in things like those? Or where do you draw the line?
No, I mean, Manu, there is like every human being, every government, every businesses has to use judgment in those situations, right? Like, I am not saying just because you can't block Netflix, you should not block like misinformation campaigns. I'm saying like let's assess them based on the merit of what's going on and make a call. Like I'm saying, why are you? Because there is a religious element, and the BJP strongly likes to be associated with the idea of like protecting Hindu values. That they spent money and time on something that seems to be factual in nature. Why are we spending time on that? For sure, if there are other governments playing a role in misinformation in the election campaign here, we talk about previous episodes. We've discussed the role of Chinese in Bangladesh and in Maldives, or Russia in US and so on. Like I get that, like and we need to work on that, and we should ask the tools to be careful around it, and if there is government and police action involved to help substantiate the claims, that we should address those issues. But everybody has to use judgment, and in the same way here, the government should use judgment around what makes sense. Mitali, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I actually see them as two different situations. First on Wikipedia, as Manu, very clearly outlined, it's a not for profit. And the aim over there is to work with a community of volunteers. The aim is to have, as I said, right at the start, it's not based on one academic's work. This is what crowdsourcing looks like, and this is what crowdsourcing can be in its most powerful form, which is holding those in power to account, which is sort of checks and balances. And I came across a really interesting note someone had shared. I'm sorry, I forget her name, where she talked about how she was working with a particular political party, and one of those politicians wanted to continually take down a certain reference about criminal proceedings against him. He would take it down, in the next 24 hours it would be back again, take it down, next 24 back again. It was a sign that this is what really powerful crowdsourcing looks like. And just to be clear, as she clarified as well, this is not a party that is in power, but a party that is in opposition. So it's not about her writing something against a particular party. So I think we have to be cognizant of the strength of this. Certainly it should go to court, but I think two things stand out. One, that the Wikimedia Foundation actually said that they had reached out to the petitioners before the hearing in good faith, saying that they would approach the court for direction. And apparently the petitioners then chose to initiate contempt proceedings even before the foundation could speak to the court. Now, just as an external entity, I think there has to be a level of faith and trust when you're approaching the court, that there will be fair balance in how different parties are treated, right? This immediately puts, I think, organizations based outside of India, with their backs against the wall. The second thing that I found really interesting in this entire observation, when the Delhi High Court asked for these details to be divulged, was that the justice actually made a very scathing comment, and then he reacted saying, "We will not take it anymore. If you don't like India, don't work here." I think this is frankly, a pretty dangerous line for India's legal heads to take. Here you have a country that's trying to engage and court a lot of large global organizations. If you come down with this, this is my turf, and if you don't like it, then get out of here. I'm not sure what precedent you're setting, either in that case, either in terms of what is the likelihood that I will get a fair and transparent hearing, and equal parity in terms of how I'm dealt with. So that's my take on Wikipedia, and I think it has honestly been a really powerful source of information. So it's not a fly by night entity. I think that's clear as well, and we should respect that while looking at this situation. I'll make a quick point about Netflix, because I know you want to say something, Ruchir.
I want to talk about Wikipedia. So can you like, let's come back to Netflix. I actually want to clarify this point because this seems to be the most widely reported point, that if you don't want to be in India, leave. I'm curious, was that in reaction to something, Manu or Mitali? Do you know from the case notes? Like, did the lawyer say something which is why the court reacted that way? My assumption was that maybe they were using some definitions from abroad, and that's why the court was upset about it.
My understanding is that the
So,
council said, and Manu probably knows this more, but
please
my
go ahead.
limited understanding is that the platform basically said, we are taking time to respond because we are not based in India. At which point there was this lashing saying, well, then get out. But Manu may know more about what happened there.
I don't know any further than what you both said, but regardless of what was said, the fact that they have engaged with the court proceedings in India, the fact, in most proceedings, it is fair to seek time to provide a considered and well articulated response. And there's no, I think, justification that you have to do it immediately or anything like that. If you see, the next date of hearing has been pushed to end of October. It's not that our courts are actually functioning at such high pace and efficiency that it's the lawyers and litigants who are not keeping up, right? But I do think, and I hope that courts do not fall for this, right? That every time I, Manu, an Indian citizen or representing an Indian organization, sues a entity which is outside the country or headquartered elsewhere in the world, this whole like India versus the world, I mean, the law does not distinguish, in a sense, there are few rights that a citizen has more than anything else, but ANI is not a citizen. ANI is a person, is a juristic person. So ANI has the same rights as Wikipedia or Wikimedia or anybody else. They are also a person. A citizen has a few additional rights in that sense, but ultimately I don't think we should fall for that sort of false distinction of if you're in India, come here. If you're not, so are they trying to say that Indian organizations can sort of if there's an Indian spin-off of Wikipedia, they can come and do anything? No, the rules, the IT rules clearly says even Twitter needs to have local legal representatives. Facebook, Meta needs to have local representatives, so on. They don't distinguish. The law does not distinguish. You are a California based, you are a London based organization, and so on. So I think that is wrong. And I do think, Richard, going back, and then I'll maybe go back to Mitali on Netflix, is I think, initially there was a lot of, a lot of people were in favor of absolutism in terms of free speech. I think the early days, the heady days of internet, was, user privacy, anonymity, and so on, right? I mean, Twitter used to be full of, those eggheads for many years, that the early years that I can remember. And I think slowly people have started developing an appetite for regulation. And this is, I think, where the entire world is, right? I mean, even in the United States, I think last week or thereabouts, around this time of the Twitter in Brazil controversy, a United States a Supreme Court judge, if I recall, specifically said that, now these people all have to fall in line. So this is even the United States, where it is essentially absolutist, starting to talk a slightly more regulatory tone. And I think this is mainly because of the amount of misinformation, the amount of sort of I guess extent of protection that is um, imagined, for social media intermediaries and so on. So I think we are entering an interesting age where we will see more regulation, maybe stronger regulation, and a lot of this may not be effective, but definitely I think will be in response to this growing threat of mis and disinformation. Mitali, back to you for Netflix.
Yeah, no, I on Netflix, I think I just have a really stronger view, which is that this is essentially subterfuge. This has been a problem with this government, and I'm not saying it's unique to this government. There are several other governments across the world that use this model, where you basically appropriate culture to the point that you want it to toe a particular line. There have been a series of films that have been hotly debated for whether or not they are factually correct, for whether or not they are portraying one community in a bad light. The name of Kashmir Files comes to mind. Now, here you have another film which is frankly showing the warts of what happened at that time. There were mistakes that occurred, there were goof ups that occurred, and it could have been perhaps an avoidable element or event in India's history, but it wasn't. And the important thing should be that there are lessons to learn from there. When you sort of double down on, well, this doesn't put us in a good light, so we're going to stamp it out, it's really dangerous, I think, for performing arts and culture, and wholly avoidable. And the other thing is that, to my mind, these are all and please forgive my language, but these are sort of manageable shitstorms, where you can double down and you quickly find one bad guy or one bad woman. You sort of focus on that, you build a whole storm around it, you say you're going to take action, because these are easy to drum up and then easy to pull down, but they tend to take up so much time and mind space for people watching on, thinking, yes, absolutely, that's the thing to take on. I mean, frankly speaking, for this government, are you kidding me? Is this in the list of top 100 things to solve at this point in time? I don't think so, And culture is political and art is political, and it should be allowed to have the space to do that, So the Netflix thing, frankly, is just, I think it's a waste of time. Is my view,
That's it's. I feel the same. Like as soon as I saw that, I was like, this is just pandering more than anything else, and you're wasting taxpayer funds.
So, with that, I think we've spent a lot of time explaining and defending free speech, and hopefully, one day we will be as good as Elon Musk has been for the last 2 years. Let's move on to the next topic, and I'll give the background, and I would love to hear from the two of you, because I've, having worked a little bit in Parliament and in politics as such, for someone like me, this is a huge issue, but I can understand a lot of people being very nonplussed about what the big deal is with the parliamentary committees, right? So typically parliamentary standing committees have a very sort of unsung role in terms of how democracy and politics of the country has played over the last 75 years. As we all see, and we get to see the theater of parliament, right? And there's cameras everywhere, and we get to see the best speeches and the worst sort of political gimmicking within the halls of parliament, within the halls of legislative assemblies across India. One thing that we don't ever get to see, and a lot of politicians over the years have told me that that's the way they want to keep it, is what happens in the parliamentary standing committee. People like Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, many others, have told me that these parliamentary standing committees are where the actual work of parliament is done, right? The rest is all just sound and fury. But the parliamentary committees are essentially sort of bodies constituted along the lines of the various government ministries. So, for example, there'll be a parliamentary standing committee for external affairs, right? So there's an external affairs ministry and there's a corresponding standing committee which will scrutinize and hold accountable the Ministry of External Affairs. They will go through the various policies and actions, and they also have a role in checking how the money is being spent. If the Parliament of India allocates 1,000 crores for, say, the External Affairs Ministry, whether that's being spent in line with various procedures and due processes of law. So it's very important. And parliament committees that are made with MPs from the two houses, the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, cutting across party lines. So there is a great deal also of time spent understanding, and there is a, I would say, a certain extent of consensus building. I know it's something we've not seen in the last many years in Indian politics, but they do try to build some level of foundational or fundamental consensus and try to pass. Of course, the a good example is the three criminal law reform bills, right? So these were brought in last year. They were passed through Parliament uh, in amidst din. So all there were 140 MPs who were suspended that particular day, and the three laws which changed the entire criminal law system in India were passed without any discussion, right? But if I were to only tell you that, that does make it sound like there was absolutely no discussion or thinking at all. But it's not the case, because there was a committee, a parliamentary committee that was constituted to look into the three bills before it was brought into the House of Parliament for voting. And during that time, I personally know members from the DMK and other parties actually contributed to the development of these laws. Though we opposed the laws for very many reasons, there were also opportunities to ensure that certain aspects of the laws could be altered, tinkered, modified, and improved. So these are very important. Now, why are we discussing this now? Because uh, the last 10 years, but definitely in the last 6 years. So that was after the 2019 election and now after the 2024 federal general elections. The government of India has been, and by extension also the speaker and the chairman of the Rajya Sabha, they've been a little lax in constituting the parliamentary committee. So now that it's been 4 months since the election was completed, or at least 3 months from June when the new government was sworn in, they have not constituted all the parliamentary committees which they should have. And for example, one of the key committees which everybody looks towards is the Public Accounts Committee, which goes into scrutinizing very many very important functions, expenditure, important agencies and regulatory bodies like SEBI and so on, right? And this is a very important and integral part of our overall legislative scrutiny, and that make sure there is some accountability on the government, the executive, and by extension regulatory bodies like SEBI. So I think that's the reason this has suddenly come back into focus. But Mitali, I know you've been tracking SEBI and this piece for a while now. So how do you see this delay, and how do you see the latest sort of developments around SEBI with regard to this?
Yeah, no, and just before I get into it, Manu, and thank you for explaining that. It's always so great to hear you clearly lay out things. One of the points of contention also seems to be, Manu, this issue of chairpersonship. Who should chair these committees? Why is that so vital? And are there examples from what happened, say, in the previous run of the government, where this chairpersonship became an issue? Because this has been quite a high octane point, hasn't it? I mean, you've heard people like Mahua Mitra, Karti Chidambaram really talk about how it's a bit of a lockjam inside these parliamentary committees. Why is the chairpersonship so important, and is it that there is a history of things not working in consensus that has made it such a big issue now?
Well, you know, as far as I know, there is no law that governs the number of standing committees that must be chaired by a member of the opposition. By and large, it has been convention that the key parliamentary standing committees, especially those that pertain to finance, home, defense, external affairs, are typically chaired by a member of the main opposition party. Now, as you know, both in 2014 and 2019, because Congress did not have the numbers, they were not uh, regarded legally or officially as the opposition party, right? So in a sense, the government of the day, of that day, and the chairperson of the Rajya Sabha and the speaker of the Lok Sabha could, in a sense, bypass some of these conventions that have built over the last 50, 70 years. But now that Congress is clearly the opposition party and it has the minimum number, and and that is why you have Mr. Rahul Gandhi as the leader of the opposition, who is now, I think, equivalent to a cabinet rank person. And therefore I think there should be there is a greater expectation now that the key standing committees should be given to the Congress. And of course, by Congress meaning the India alliance, the India bloc of parties, and then they will decide amongst them who will be the in other similar parliamentary systems, the Westminster parliamentary systems, at least in the UK and in Australia, which I am familiar with, you have almost shadow ministers, right? So you have the prime minister, the leader of the opposition, almost on par. Then you have the finance minister, and then the shadow finance minister, the home minister, the shadow home minister. And there's some sort of an understanding that they will sort of keep each other in check. But in India, we don't have that convention. And really, this is the way the parliamentary standing committees are the way we can keep a check on the other side, and how the government is functioning or not. And that's why it's all the more important now. But sorry, did that explain?
Yeah, I did, and I'll make a quick point about the one we were discussing, and then I think Ruchir might have thoughts on both the SEBI chief and on the committees, which is that it's sort of been a perfect storm that's been built since we last spoke about Madhavi Puri Butch, because now you have, of course, questions around SEBI's investigation into the Hindenburg research against the Adani Group. But the opposition party, the Congress, has now raised questions about payments that she received from her former employer, ICICI Bank, while she was with SEBI. There are questions that have been raised about investments into the Wockhardt Group. There are allegations made by Z's founder, Subhash Chandra, who's actually gone out and called her corrupt, and that she actually had a role in the failure of the proposed merger between Sony and Z. But I think the most problematic, or two most problematic, is the fact that yesterday or day before, there was an open demonstration by SEBI employees outside the building, complaining about both the toxic work culture and demanding that she resign from her position. And secondly, a scroll report, which has pointed to an anonymous source, but a senior SEBI source, saying that Ms. Butch did not actually divulge any of the conflict of interest holdings that she had to the Securities and Exchange Board. Um, I think it's sort of gotten to an unprecedented point in the history of this position that SEBI chiefs have had. And now there is the very real expectation that this is going to go to a parliamentary committee. It's been sort of, from whatever I understand, it's being termed in a very banal fashion. It's called performance review of regulatory bodies or something like that. So, very vanilla. But I think the express aim here is to pick up all these allegations against the SEBI chief and perhaps into what this regulatory body now stands for. Um, I'll just repeat that word. I think it's unprecedented, honestly, in the history of this position. I have not seen this sort of internal and external pressure come onto someone. And I think it's really important this committee is set up and questions are answered. And I think it's really important that transparency is brought into this situation. It's now it's now untenable, that there is not enough clarity on all these allegations, and that she continues to stay in her position without clarity, transparency on whether or not this conflict of, or these many conflicts of interest were shared. It's just not a good look. Ruchir, how have you been reading it?
It's interesting, right? Like one of the things, just as a market participant, when you think about SEBI or RBI in India, you think of them to be just about the controversies, because their reputation results in people feeling comfortable either investing or holding on to rupees and so on and so forth. My initial reaction when the Hindenburg report came out was more around how somebody who wanted a trade basically put reports out in favor of that trade, and that's basically and the market hadn't reacted to it, so I sort of wrote it off lightly. I think now that there are a lot more reports that have come out since, in my mind, I think this is a great time to reflect in terms of expectations from heads of RBI and SEBI. Like, what do we want from these roles, especially in terms of them declaring the conflicts of interest, as you highlighted. Them, we discussed on the on the previous episode about how we want them to be open about their holdings, so we know when they make certain judgment calls, what their holdings are, and if we need to call those out. I will say one thing, which is I think of SEBI more as an executive function than I do RBI. I think RBI's role is more around, say, protecting our monetary base and employment, whereas I think of SEBI more as uh, also managing the mandate of the government. So I do think of the SEBI head as partly a reflection of the current government, and in some ways, as a result, it is very tricky for her to hold on to the role based on the questioning that's happened. I obviously, because I'm not in the camp where people are guilty before proven. For me, like, an investigation is important, but I also buy the idea that her role is so sensitive in that, like, the markets will not consider SEBI to be fair. That her resigning may be a good outcome because you don't want people to doubt. Um,
Richard, can you go back and explain a little bit more of why you think SEBI should be treated as as a quasi executive role, or as to be doing, if I understand correctly, some part of the government's bidding, or to be aligned with the government. Why do you say that, and how?
Mainly because of SEBI is effectively oversees the markets. They are defining what is a security, how should a security be floated. I mean, effectively, you're saying that certain, um, you're defining the rules of how a business should function in many ways, and those rules constitute how an economy functions fundamentally. When a government comes to power, a big part of the economic agenda is how businesses can operate. And so, in my mind, SEBI is one of the key, like, besides, say, the registrar of companies and the ministry that oversees all of these functions. SEBI is one of those places where they can implement and effectuate policy. So, in my mind, there, the independence of, like, whether you believe it is independent or not is secondary to the idea that actually the government is going to execute their plans partly through SEBI, and so they're going to appoint the people in SEBI and so on. So I think SEBI is less independent in terms of government than RBI is, how I think about it.
But don't you think that ultimately, in anyone in that position, Richard, is actually accountable to only one person, and that is the investor? Whatever size or shape the investor may take, because the government, honestly, is also an interested party for the market. Like, a lot of public service enterprises come to the market to raise capital to get listed. So, if the SEBI chief is sitting in a position where they are protecting the interests of the government, that's theoretically, that's not actually in favor of an investor.
I don't fully disagree with that. I think the part I agree with you on, Mitali, is primarily that if you have so many people coming out and say, hey, the SEBI chairperson has done this in favor of this person, as in like all these corruption allegations, I do think that tarnishes the expectation I have from the markets, which is of fairness. So that is a problem, and I think as a result, we should, like her resigning, I'm not against, although I'm more in the camp of let's investigate and make sure that we do right by everybody involved, right? But on the piece of pure, like, should SEBI be independent of the government? I don't think it's possible. That's like where my mind is. I think whether or not we want it to be, ultimately SEBI is such, I mean, look at the number, like, is it, how much is invested in the Indian markets? I don't have the number on top of my head, but I think it's like tens of thousands of crores. And if that is true, or lakhs of crores, then so much of economic policy is going to be defined through SEBI. And if that is also true, then the government will want to have a very strong say. And I mean, they have a say now in RBI, and we've discussed that in the previous episode on the dividend it gets and so on. So both places are heavily influenced by the government. Practically, it's not possible, I think, for them to be as independent as we want them to be.
Fair enough. I do. I think I appreciate the explanation, and maybe there's two parts to it. One is that, see, by law, the appointment of the SEBI chairperson and the members, there's a great deal of say from the government, right? So it cannot be somebody who would be would not be in alignment with government policies. But again, the it also means that, does this mean by going after SEBI, there is no protection for the government? Meaning, if the SEBI chairperson was to resign, or was to be removed, or to fall, from grace, that would actually reflect directly on the government, right? And almost this means that the government would dig its heels much more deeper to ensure that there is, all these sort of allegations, accusations are ultimately proven wrong. Which also leads us to the next part, which is that, then can the government itself launch a fair inquiry into these allegations, right? And then again, then the matter goes back to whether it should be like a court monitored investigation, so on. Which brings us back to actually one part of this parliamentary standing committee's piece, which we have not exploited well enough. If you see, go to the US Congress, and you will see all these Senate committee for this. So there's a Senate committee for judicial appointments, right? So the president of the United States can say, hey, I want so and so to be the next justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. But they have to be verified, vetted, and they have to get through the entire Senate committee. And a lot of those are also very well televised, so we know how that functions. And it is I think, comes across as a very, very tough and excruciating sort of interview process, where they go into every single life choice, personal, professional, that person has made. Maybe that's an extreme case of how the Senate committees are used. But maybe, again, instead of us going back to the court and telling the court, can you please appoint a retired judge to look into the SEBI allegations, or the allegations against the SEBI chairperson, maybe we've not used these parliamentary standing committees better, and just sort of trying to bring this back to that point. Any thoughts on those, Mitali or Richard?
I'm just going to point out the irony in some, like, as in, if you want to upgrade, so, this part started with Sashi Tharoor saying, hey, the convention was to appoint opposition leaders. And my view is that, like, conventions are meant to be broken. Like, we should do things that improve the system, like you just pointed out right now, Manu, which is like the Senate hearing committees. How, if we could have a public way of testing appointments, that may not be a bad thing. So I think if conventions break because the balancing act improves especially balancing power, that's not a bad thing. And I think we should look to systems just overall. My guess is, and I was like, I tried to do a bit of homework, but it's not complete. Like some of the parliamentary committees are obviously, we inherited them from the Westminster system, and part of that was some of these committees started in 1950s, but a lot of new committees came to force in 1993. But when I was looking up the older committees, the part of the process of appointing opposition members of the committee or chairs of the committee dates back that far, because at that point in time Congress was ultra powerful, and that there was no other political party that had a strong base. So as a result, this was a way of engaging and growing other political parties in the country. And obviously that's like now, different parties have a stronger role to play. So I understand why BJP wants to have a stronger role to play. They did get elected. I mean, let's not write them off. So I'm okay if the party in power gets to decide who gets sits in the committee, but I'm also okay that we improve the system overall, so that we move forward as a country.
My sort of limited last point on this, Manu, is, and I know we've discussed this with the Chief Election Commission as well. Ultimately, and as Ruchir was saying as well, I think we're kind of aligned. All of us are aligned on that. Is that this is a trust gap, and when a trust gap opens up, it becomes very dangerous, because this is institutional integrity we're talking about. I mean, it's not like people are sort of out there saving lives, but even as business journalists, honestly, this used to be part of like why you had to really measure the words that you did when you were reporting, because what you said had potential impact on someone's hard earned savings. And that's a big thing. It's not me shooting the breeze saying, well, I think this is happening with this politician. It is that what you say about a company or what you say about an event can fundamentally change how people make decisions about their money, how they save it, how they invest it. And I think ultimately it boils down to that. Some conventions should, to my mind, stay, and I think institutional integrity is one of them. So it just leaves a very bad taste in the mouth. I wish she would just be more transparent, come out, answer questions, take it on, and sort it out, because this doesn't help anyone.
It's also a bummer that it's a female. Like I feel like sometimes, when we have female leaders and we have a reputational damage, like people have a tendency to then put all females in one bucket, and it sucks. Anyway, that was just a passing thought.
There's two filters actually, Ruchir. One is female and the other is ICICI Bank. Like, I don't know what that is about. Seeing me happen.
Anyways,
So, yeah.
we are already in the have you heard territory, Aapne Suna Kya, where every week we try to cover issues and end cover issues that people not have heard of, and end the show on a lighter note. Who wants to go first?
Let me go first, because mine is a little bit more dated, because I missed last week's have you heard. But mine is not like it's a tribute. So the tribute is to legal constitutional scholar and well-known lawyer A.G. Nurani, who was a phenomenal writer, definitely a towering intellect, whose views on constitutional matters, especially on Kashmir, the rise of the Hindu right, and general take on civil liberties, I think shaped a lot of my own thinking. He's written some fantastic books. He's the leading voice, according to me, with regard to Kashmir, Article 370. But not only that, the Babri Masjid Ayodhya dispute, the RSS, and so on and so forth. My tribute to him specifically is that I think I've tried to learn so much from him, but I think as a writer, that I think his own writings and his words really shaped how I think I've thought of writing and so on. So mine is a tribute to AG Nurani. If anybody hasn't sort of yet come across, please look up his books on constitutional questions, which was released in 2006, and the other one, my all-time favorite, called RSS: A Menace to India.
Richie, you want to
Ruchir?
go next?
All right, sure. I actually wanted to talk about Paralympics, but maybe I'll save it till the next episode. It's incredible, the performance. I read a story about the longest running company in the world, which is called Congo Gumi in Japan. I don't know why, but Japanese have a real tradition of making companies last through families. In many ways, it's a little bit Indian. Um, they initially started with the construction of Buddhist temples, and for generations, they were the go to contractors in Japan to build Buddhist temples. And then over time, interestingly, like especially when wars came and money was not being spent on temples, they pivoted to building high quality funeral caskets, which made sure that they were afloat. And so, like in the family, there has been tradition passed down of carpentry and building, and for 40 generations until 2006, the same family owned the business. In 2006, they sold it to another construction company, but it still operates under the same name, and you still have the family involved. It's amazing how tradition can last in business. I mean, it's effectively an income source that's passed down generations. I thought that was incredible.
That's fantastic. And after moving house, I can confirm, Ruchir, the only two skills to have are carpentry and plumbing. Everything else is just noise. Especially journalism is just noise, completely not useful. I actually do have the Olympics on my Have You Heard, but mine is couple goals, which is that I think we've all seen these images of Tara Davis Woodhall, as she calls herself, and Hunter Woodhall, both 25, both now Olympians and both Olympic gold medalists. One, of course, is a para athlete, and Tara is, a track and field player. But it's just quite incredible to see this couple in action. I was reading up about them. Apparently, they met in 2017. They sort of, stayed in touch, and they're just such huge supporters of each other, that they really feel a lot of what they've achieved is because they're a couple and because they've motivated each other so much. And an interesting thing which I didn't know about them is that another thing they like to do on the side is apparently flip houses. So they enjoy dabbling in real estate while they're not winning Olympic gold medals. But it was just like looking at them on track and cheering each other on was just such a wow moment.
That's cool. Although I don't know how anyone who does flipping of houses enjoys that. It just seems so hard.
Not
um,
Not as hard
and
as winning
then,
an Olympic medal, but
well, yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Probably harder, I think. But if they can survive that, I suppose they are made for each other. Thank you, everyone, for joining this episode. Please write to us. We love hearing from you. We are at indiadialoguepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, Mitali at Mitali Live, Manu at Manuraj1983. I am Ruchir underscore P. The podcast is at TID underscore podcast. We're also on YouTube at India Dialogue Podcast. Thank you again for listening in, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye.